Hello, I'm Dennis O'Hara, a photographer from Duluth, Minnesota. I've been photographing the scenery around Duluth and the Lake Superior region for many years now, and much of what I enjoy photographing are the lighthouses, ships, and shoreline of the Duluth Harbor. I've often wondered what this area was like in the early days of sailing ships and steamboats, particularly in an age when lighthouses played a critical role guiding ships into safe harbor before the days of modern navigation. While all of the area lighthouses are special, Minnesota Point Lighthouse was the first high-powered light on Lake Superior and one of the finest on all of the Great Lakes. The ancient lighthouse is a true relic of the past that has silently stood its ground at the end of Minnesota Point for more than 150 years. While the Minnesota Point Lighthouse is represented today only by the ruins of its once proud tower, it remains an important part of our area's rich nautical history. I'd like to introduce you to this important landmark and hope that this presentation draws you into the wonderful story of a hidden treasure of Duluth. The Minnesota Point Lighthouse sits at the end of Minnesota Point, otherwise known as Park Point, which is 7 miles in length and when included with adjacent Wisconsin Point, makes it the largest freshwater sandbar in the world with a total length of 10 miles. While the lighthouse ruins are isolated and approachable today only by boat or a 1.5-mile hike through the historic pine forest, it was once the center of marine activity and a prosperous fur trading post and commercial fishing village. Exploration and fur trade began in the region in the mid-1600s and lasted for nearly 200 years. The French voyagers' exploration of the Lake Superior area predates the landing of the Mayflower at Plymouth Rock in 1620. The French were very capable traders and explorers and got along very well with the natives. It was a 2-month paddle from Montreal to the head of the lakes. After the 1800 turn of the century, more and more larger ships began hauling cargo into and out of the area. The region's abundant natural resources, consisting primarily of fur and fishing, were very lucrative trades at that time. Most of the merchant ships between 1800 and 1830 were wooden, 2-masted schooners, much like this one. They were about 70 feet in length and were capable of carrying approximately 150 tons, or 1,500 barrels of cargo with a crew of 3 or 4 men. After 1792, the Northwest Company established several posts on Minnesota rivers and lakes and in areas to the west and northwest for trading with the Ojibwe and Dakota and other native tribes. The first of these posts was located in Superior, Wisconsin, just across the bay from where the lighthouse sits today. Known as Fort St. Louis, it became the headquarters for Northwest Company's new Fond du Lac department. The post was abandoned once the French became occupied in the War of 1812. Between 1812 and 1853, the area fur trade was controlled by the American Fur Trading Company with a trading post and fort at the upriver community of Fond du Lac. In 1853, George Stuntz, a local surveyor turned entrepreneur, operated his own successful trading post at the Superior Entry. Stuntz traded with local Indians who lived along the point. Stuntz built a dock, warehouse, and trading post. This made him the first white resident of Duluth. His dock on Park Point, then called Stuntz Point, was the only one on the entire bay. Therefore, every steamboat and sailing vessel headed for Superior had to stop there. Its passengers and cargo ferried across in Mackinaw boats. Stuntz became a powerful regional leader in the following years. In 1823, Lieutenant Henry Wesley Bayfield of the British Navy began the first survey of Lake Superior. He designated a spot on Minnesota Point as 0 Point for the lake-wide survey. When the Minnesota Point Lighthouse was built, the tower itself was placed over Lieutenant Bayfield's 0 Point, and this became known as the 0 Point Lighthouse. Here's a picture of one of the survey markers that still exists at the end of Park Point. In the fall of 1854, the federal government set out to treaty with the Chippewa. Government officials and over 5,000 Chippewa gathered at La Pointe in the Apostle Islands to consider the terms of the federal proposal. As a result of the treaty, vast wilderness areas of land were opened for industry, settlements, and homesteading. This was all part of opening up the Northwest Territory, but the event that really triggered commerce and immigration at the head of the lakes was the opening of the Soo Locks in 1855. With adoption of the treaty and the opening of the Soo Locks, dozens of men staked their claims along the North Shore, principally where copper was thought to be at the mouth of the larger streams, and many preempted land around Duluth where several town sites were plotted. Mineral prospectors and land speculators immediately swarmed in, staking claims along the Minnesota side of St. Louis Bay and River, as well as up the North Shore nearly to Grand Portage. During the weeks of negotiation leading up to the treaty, some of the speculators paddled secretly up the North Shore to preempt claims in the most promising locations. And most of the men who came in that era were prospectors and land cruisers trying to stake claims to mineral lands for outsiders. There were very few women at the first, and many of the adventurers married Ojibwe women. With the opening of the Soo Locks in 1855, it also became possible for even larger vessels to enter Lake Superior from Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, and opening ship traffic from New York to the head of the lakes. Seeing the natural Superior entry between Minnesota and Wisconsin points as the best way to enter Safe Harbor, the federal government commissioned a lighthouse and keeper's residence at the southern end of Minnesota Point to help mariners find the entry. Congress appropriated $15,000 on March 3, 1855 for a lighthouse at Minnesota Point. Work on the foundation of the structure started in the fall of 1856, and materials were stockpiled at the point that year in preparation for completing the lighthouse the following season. This drawing depicts the original design of the light tower. The contract for constructing the lighthouse and two short wooden piers to mark Superior entry was awarded to Captain R.G. Coburn of Superior, but stonemason Adam Dopp, a German immigrant who came to the country in 1848, is credited with doing most of the work on the lighthouse. Because of difficulties with weather and material deliveries in 1857, it would take another year to complete the structures. The light was finally activated in the spring of 1858. It's interesting to note that at the time the lighthouse was built, Superior City consisted of 2,500 residents and had become a city in 1852. Minnesota had just become a state in 1848, Abraham Lincoln was president, Civil War was on the horizon, and Duluth did not exist as a city for another 15 years. The 12-foot diameter foundation of the tower was laid with blue rubble stone, and the walls were built with red brick brought by ship from Cleveland. The attached 1.5-story dwelling was also built with the same brick and topped with a slate roof. The 40-foot tower, which stood on the water's edge at that time, had two 12-pane windows, one at ground level and the other on the opposite of the tower just below the lantern room, and was backplastered inside and out with a white lime and cement mortar mix, making it easier to see from the lake. Once the tower was topped with a wooden lantern room, the circular structure stood a total of 50 feet high. The lantern room was shingled except for windows on the lakeside for the beacon. A fifth-order Fresnel lens was installed, giving a fixed red indication. The final cost ended up to be $13,675. This may have been the last time that a federal government project came in under budget. As with all Fresnel lenses, the fifth-order Fresnel lens installed in the light was a true work of art. Made by Bardot of Paris, the constant red signal was fueled by kerosene. The lens stood 21.3 inches and weighed 400 pounds. The range of the light was up to 10 nautical miles on a clear night. Stories have it that prior to the sandbar shifting, when the lighthouse was still at the edge of the shore, fishermen could row their boats around the lighthouse during heavy spring runoff. R.H. Barrett, a good friend of George Stunt's, moved across the bay and became the first keeper. He lived at the lighthouse with his wife Stella and their 4 children. When thick fog rendered the light useless, Barrett, his assistant, or in some cases his wife, would blow a warning through a logging camp dinner horn. They would keep blowing the horn until the incoming ship would signal a reply. Local residents called it Barrett's Cow because it sounded like a farmyard to residents who would hear it on the foggy days. Today, you can see Barrett's old horn at the St. Louis County Historical Society in Duluth. In all, there were 6 lighthouse keepers that manned the Minnesota Point Light. They were R.H. Barrett, the first keeper, followed by Commodore Horace Saxton, Duluth, J.B. Greenfield, Superior, Patrick McCann from Marquette, G.M. Grover from Bayfield, and Robert Sanborn of Duluth. Meanwhile, on the other side of the bay in Minnesota, Duluth was quietly growing, and with the prodding of financier J. Cook, a railway from St. Paul was brought into Duluth in 1870. The population grew from 14 families in January of 1869 to 3,500 people by July of that year. This marked the beginning of a flood of Swedes, Norwegians, and Finns to Minnesota. Soon there were sawmills, grain elevators, and warehouses on the waterfront, and homes all over the hillside. Steamboat lines from Buffalo, Detroit, and Chicago began making regular calls at Duluth, and the development of its magnificent harbor was begun. Park Point at this time remained a fishing village until the signing of the 1854 treaties, but after that, major development on the point also began to take root. As Duluth grew through the 1860s, a strong rivalry began between the 2 towns at each end of Minnesota Point. Resenting that vessels making for Duluth had to pass through the point at its Wisconsin end, the people of Duluth attempted to build docks on the outer side of the sandbar to avoid having to use the Superior entry. However, the docks were no match for Lake Superior's fury, and they quickly deteriorated. The citizens of Duluth petitioned the government to construct a canal through the Minnesota Point at its Duluth end. The Army Corps of Engineers conducted a study and advised against the project, fearing that water levels behind the Minnesota Point would be adversely affected. Undeterred, a consortium of Duluth businessmen arranged financial backing from Philadelphia financier J. Cook and began excavating the canal independently in 1871. Shortly thereafter, Duluth had its own canal. After the Duluth Canal was dug in 1871, loading and unloading docks were constructed in the shelter of the new inner harbor soon afterward. To accommodate this growth, the natural harbor depths of 6 to 8 feet were deepened by the Corps of Engineers to 12 feet in 1867 and 1874 and to 16 feet in 1881 and 82. When new locks were also built by the Corps of Engineers in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. So the growth of Duluth accelerated through the 1870s. Flour mills were built to process and package byproducts from the grain trade. Millions of barrels of flour were shipped from the Twin Ports to Buffalo and the East on steamers and sailing crafts. And most upbound ships brought coal cargoes from Pennsylvania and Ohio for distribution all over the West, while others brought passengers and package freight of all kinds. Here's a picture of Duluth shortly after becoming a city in 1870. This picture, taken from the hillside at the time, shows the area of what is now Canal Park and Park Point. As was common with many of the lights constructed during the 1850s, the great distances involved in the district prevented frequent inspections, and thus most of the contractors worked largely unsupervised. As a result, workmanship and materials were frequently less than perfect, and the completed structures frequently deteriorated rapidly. This appears to have been the case at Minnesota Point, as the Lighthouse Board annual reports indicate that the station was in a constant state of repair. In the 1868 report for the station, it was stated that the dwelling leaks badly around the chimneys, the rain and soot have discolored the walls, and plastering has fallen in many places and is loose in nearly all the rooms. Eventually, the old keeper's dwelling was completely refurbished and continued to serve as the dwelling for the keepers, even after the light was moved. The ever-changing sandbar continued to be a problem, and as the location of the natural entry shifted, within a year of the tower's construction, it no longer stood close to the water. And today, in fact, it's about a half a mile away. With increasing shipping traffic coming into the head of the lakes, additional navigational aids around the harbor were needed. In June of 1878, work commenced on a pierhead light on the north side of the Superior Entry atop the new concrete piers constructed to stall the ever-shifting sandbar. The prize Fresnel lens was moved from the original lighthouse tower to the new pierhead light, which was lit for the first time on September 1, 1878. The keeper for the new light resided in the brick dwelling at Minnesota Point. The move proved temporary, however, and it was returned to the original tower and relit in 1880 until a new pierhead light was constructed 5 years later. On August 6, 1885, the pierhead light was reestablished and Minnesota Point Light went dark for good. Though Minnesota Point Lighthouse was not active for too many years, when it was in service, it was known locally as the Old Standby. In 1889, another wooden pierhead beacon was built on the North Timber Pier under construction in the Superior Entry and fitted with the lens from the Minnesota Point Light, and the keeper's house was refurbished to serve the new Superior Entry pierhead light. In 1893, the Lighthouse Board determined that with the completion of the new piers at the Superior Entry, navigation would be better served with a light on the pier on the Wisconsin side of the channel, and a new light and keeper's dwelling were constructed across the channel on Wisconsin Point. Thus, the Minnesota Point keeper's dwelling was abandoned and without the constant care of the keepers, deteriorated rapidly. The new keeper's house, located on the bay side of the canal, was much larger and provided each of the two keepers with 6 rooms. At that time, an elevated walkway to the lighthouse was constructed to provide access to the beacon in stormy weather. Unfortunately, that light was destroyed in the Mataafa storm of 1905 and would be permanently replaced by the existing Superior Entry lighthouse built in 1913. Here's a picture of the plans for the new Superior Entry lighthouse. This postcard picture shows that by 1907 the lighthouse had deteriorated already. In 1908, a buoy depot was built at the end of Minnesota Point, which was used for maintenance and storage of harbor buoys and lamp oil. The lighthouse reservation at the end of Minnesota Point was chosen as a location because the land was already government-owned and it would help reduce expenditures in its construction. The 30 by 97-foot combination office, tool room, and oil house was built of concrete, and a tramway was also built that ran from the buoy shed straight out onto a wharf. The total cost of the depot was $14,000, and in this picture you can see the remains of the old Minnesota Point Lighthouse. At the turn of the century, vessel traffic into and out of Superior Harbor was also booming, and the Army Corps of Engineers undertook more improvements to the canal. As part of these improvements, a 1,000-foot protection pier was constructed on the Wisconsin side of the opening. This picture is a closer look at the end of Minnesota Point in those days. You can see the construction equipment used to upgrade the new Superior Canal, the U.S. Lighthouse Service buoy depot, and the remains of the old Minnesota Point Lighthouse. The original lighthouse was saved from being dismantled at the request of the U.S. Coast Guard and Geodetic Survey to preserve the 0 point in its base. Today, all that remains is about a 35-foot section of the original tower. It was listed in the National Register of Historic Places on December 27, 1974. The hike to the lighthouse structure wanders through magnificent red and white pine stands estimated to be over 200 years old. If you are looking for an interesting walk that will take you back in history, drive to the end of Duluth Park Point and hike about 2 miles to the site of the old Minnesota Point Lighthouse. It doesn't look like that much today, but the dilapidated tower was the first high-powered lighthouse on Lake Superior. This is the Superior Entry, as it exists today. You can see the long breakwaters that protect the actual canal during storms. So let's go through and take a look at a few more pictures from today of the old lighthouse and the old buoy station. On the old lighthouse ruins, you can still see some of the white backplastering that remains from when it was first built. And here's the tower as it sits today. And here's a look up through the tower, looking from the bottom. One of the other things is that surrounding the lighthouse, watch your step, as there seems to be a few poison ivy plants hidden in the long grass. Here's another look at the old depot station. This is the buoy depot station from the water's edge. There used to be a tram extending out onto this old dock. And an aerial picture of the buoy station. And here's an aerial picture of the entire Superior entry area, including the Burlington Northern Ore Docks in the lower part of the picture. Another look at the tower. So this is the end of the presentation. I hope you've enjoyed your visit. I would like to acknowledge the following resources for information and pictures included in this video: the Lake Superior Marine Museum Association, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, Duluth Public Library, Minnesota Historical Society, the Northeast Minnesota History Center at UMD, Terry Pepper of terrypepper.com, the Library of Congress, and Mary Beth Carlson for supplying the background music.